November 12, 1944, 8:50 a.m. He stood on the bridge, a figure framed against granite fjord walls and low, oily fog. The ship beneath his feet was vast enough to read as a city. Turrets like apartment blocks, a hull that ate the water and refused to move. Men shuffled in webbed boots. Engines thrummed in the guts of the beast. A handful of officers exchanged clipped reports. Outside, the mountains held the sound like a secret. 11 minutes later, the man who had stood there would be gone. The image is simple and terrible. A fortress anchored in a narrow Norwegian inlet, confident in its armor, its nets, its geography. It had been a problem that would not leave, what naval planners called a fleet in being, a presence that bent entire strategies toward it. Because the ship sat where it sat, Allied forces diverted planes, carriers, submarines, and men. It forced convoys into circuitous routes. Its mere existence was strategic leverage. That leverage had been earned through steel, depth charges, and a confidence born of survival. Why did the captain feel or appear so sure? The answer was not whimsical pride. The place itself contributed to a kind of invulnerability. Mountains pressed in on both sides. Anti-torpedo nets and booms protected the harbor mouth. Generators could throw out thick, choking smoke in a matter of minutes, cloaking the ship in a false weather that was supposed to make bombs fall blind. The ship's citadel, the armored heart that protected magazines and engine rooms, was built to shrug off splinters and even many direct hits. Previous attacks had scarred the upper works but not the essential backbone. The captain had watched her resist, and that resistance changed expectations. Confidence in this case was forged out of repeated survivals and the hard arithmetic of industrial war. Those survivals were not mere luck. They were a series of escalating efforts that tested every new idea the Allies could muster. Early in the campaign, audacious small craft raids, miniature submarines, and obsessive bravery had managed to wound the ship. Donald Cameron and his X-craft were part of that first intimate kind of violence. Tiny crews cramped in gutted submarines, guided beneath the hull to leave charges that punched holes below the waterline. They did damage. They proved a concept. The ship listed but did not die. The result was paradoxical. The more the Allies tried, the more the ship's endurance was proven, and the more the German command believed their fortress could hold. Then came heavier air attacks. Dive bombers smashed into the superstructure during an operation that inflicted dozens of hits and cost aircrew lives. Numbers recorded in mission logs, 122 killed in that operation as reported. The upper decks became a ruin of splintered steel and torn plating, yet the citadel endured. The ship's massive bulk absorbed punishment in a way that rendered tactical success meaningless if it couldn't be turned into strategic effect. Bombs broke guns and sent smoke columns skyward, but the Board of Industrial Defenses, the armored heart where magazines and engines sat, remained stubbornly intact. Staging options were stretched to the limit. One Allied plan tried to move a game-changing weapon closer by extraordinary means, taking heavy ordnance into the far north via Soviet bases, in a maneuver of logistics as treacherous as any battle. The idea was always the same. If you could not break her skin, you would strike under the skin. Each attempt that failed left the men in the fjord thinking they had survived something unthinkable. Each attempt that failed taught the Allies where to target next. At the center of the technological pivot that followed stood an engineer with a particular kind of stubbornness, Barnes Wallis. He had already sketched ideas that applied physics to problems of concrete and armor. He understood momentum and mass the way others understood language. His answer to mountains and armor was not more machines of war, but a change in how force met matter. Wallis did not want to punch at the armor. He wanted to attack the earth beneath it. The tall boy was Wallis's synthesis of thought and materiel. At roughly 6 tons, in its most basic description, it was a long, skinny spear of steel, finely balanced, carrying an explosive designed to amplify shock through ground rather than simply crash and shatter on contact. Dropped from high altitude with precision, it would pierce roofs or earth at terminal velocity, housing its explosive weight as deeply as possible before detonation. The key was not merely penetration, but the creation of what engineers called a camouflage. an underground cavity that suddenly collapsed, undermining foundations and producing localized seismic effects. Imagine a giant drill that doesn't just make a hole, but punches a fist through the soil and then blows out the supporting legs of whatever sits above. The ship's defenses had been honed against splintering and blast across metal. They were not designed for a shock delivered through the seabed. That is why the tall boy mattered. It treated the shore and sand as part of the fortress and then pulled that part out from under the ship. Where dive bombers attacked the armor and X-craft blew the hull below the waterline, the tall boy undermined the ground that held the hull upright. It was a different logic of damage. If you could bury a charge deep enough beneath a ship anchored on a shallow shelf, you could translate an explosion into a collapse rather than a hole. The conceptual leap had been proven already in other contexts. But to bring this weapon to the Fjord required a daring operation. Lancasters refitted as precise carriers, stripped of weight to maximize range and altitude capability. Pilots and crews trained relentlessly, practicing high-altitude aiming and timing. The Lancaster in this incarnation was a delivery system for something more like applied geology than pure aeronautics. Operation Catechism was the culmination of that adaptation. At first light, the Lancasters came in low, then climbed to deliver. They were stripped down, no extraneous armor, engines tuned for a single-minded purpose. The bombs they carried were the tall boys, long, lethal, and designed to detonate after penetrating deep into earth or structure. The approach was surgical and cold. Crews knew the math. Navigators knew the fjord's wrinkles and where air currents would bite. On the ship, radar screens had been keyed to pick up the telltale contacts. Men watched dials and listened for the characteristic blip of incoming aircraft. Someone called an order that would become the narrative pivot of the morning. Smoke, make smoke. It was the practical invocation of a defense that had been drilled into crews. Fill the air with artificial fog and blind the bomber's optics. Let the mountains swallow the visual cues. Make it harder to aim. That warning in the narrative laid out by the title becomes the hinge of the story. A directive shouted into the wind, designed to mask and mislead, and therefore to save. But warning and effectiveness are different things. The weather that morning had an irony waiting. The wind, the invisible arbiter of air and sea, was calm. Calm trapped the smoke, let it hang low and dense, and turned it into a carpet rather than a curtain. Instead of reading as an impenetrable shroud, the smoke screen smothered in place, failing to throw off the bomber's sightlines as intended. Instruments and human eyes both struggled against a stillness that made concealment a lie. What happened next was a choreography of timing and catastrophic precision. The Lancasters came in. They released their tall boys on the marker runs they'd practiced until muscle memory ruled the flight deck. For the crew below, those drops were remote. For the men on the bridge, the world detonated in sequences of sound and motion. The first tall boy struck at 8:41 a.m., not on the armored belt, but in the sandbank beneath the ship's keel. The bomb did exactly what it was meant to do. It buried itself and then detonated, converting its momentum into subterranean catastrophe. The ground does not behave like a hull. Where a shell makes a neat tear, a camouflage removes support. The first explosion effectively liquefied the sand that canted the vessel on its moorings, turning solid footing into pudding. That blow was the invisible strike. The ship did not go down then. It began to betray itself. Structures that relied on the seabed for stability adjusted and shifted. Plates stressed in new ways. Turrets, once proud and fixed, felt a sudden, unaccountable motion. A second tall boy hit. Even the most hardened minds are not immune to the arithmetic of repeated punishment. Each strike amplified the first's effect, enlarging the cavity and propagating the shock through steel and human flesh alike. The Citadel, so long believed immune, began to experience a cascade of failures no individual armor could resist. Turrets sheared from their bearings. Communications lines died in an electrical blackout. Crew compartments flooded or were crushed by sudden twists in the hull. Minute by minute, the drama intensified. Men on deck watched the angles of the ship's superstructure change with the unforgiving slowness of a catastrophe that had already begun. There were specific images that stuck in survivor testimony and in after-action notes. A turret ripped outward like a door blown off its hinges, a smokestack collapsing in a ragged metallic hand, the deck listing as if it had been heaved by some enormous sea monster. Inside, in the ruined corridors, survivors reported the uncanny sound of tapping, faint signals from pockets of air where men had been trapped amid lattices of wreckage, small, desperate Morse codes of hope. The timeline compressed toward the decisive moment. At 8:41, the first tall boy had found the sand. Engineers and historians later described how the detonation under the keel had the effect of undermining the structure. The ship's bottom, deprived of consistent support, flexed and tore in places no armor could reach. Systems began to fail rapidly. The list increased in degrees that could be measured by the eye, but only fully understood by those who had to stand and run on a deck that no longer had level ground. 11 minutes after that first damning hit, at roughly 8:52 a.m., the ship rolled. There was no gradual surrender. It was a mechanical, irrevocable movement in which the balance of thousands of tons broke, and gravity did the rest. The great bulk turned, finding an angle where buoyancy no longer preserved it. In a matter of seconds, the ship heeled hard, the deck tilted into the sky, and water rushed, now unopposed, into ruptured compartments. The captain disappeared into that new geometry of ruin. Whether he went down by order, by loyalty, or in the desperate failure of options, may forever be a question of human interpretation. The record that survived the smoke and hissing metal is clear on outcomes. The city of the ship collapsed. 971 men would be lost. 87 survivors would be pulled from the water and smashed wreckage, bodies and faces that told a story of sudden and incomprehensible change. It is here that the title's assertion, 11 minutes after ignoring a warning, this German captain disappeared, must be treated with care. The warning was present, an alarm, a radio call, the order to make smoke. But orders are gestures, not guarantees. The wind and the nature of the defensive smoke turned the warning against itself. The captain's posture on the bridge, commanding, steady, was informed by months and years of survival. He had seen the ship shrug off blades of steel and torrents of fire. The narrative of an ignored warning is a story device, a way of staging causality, so that we can ask why a fortress failed. It is not necessarily a judicial condemnation of a single man's judgment. It is a dramatic frame that holds the facts. There was a warning. The smoke could not do its work. The tall boy struck beneath the keel, and in 11 minutes, everything known to the captain unmade him. The human toll is brutal to list, not because numbers anesthetize tragedy, but because they are necessary to keep the story honest. Records indicate 971 dead and 87 rescued. Those survivors' accounts gave the cold, specific texture to the collapse. Men who had been thrown from rails, who had clung to flotsam, who had been pulled up from the water by daring boats and fractured rafts. Some were found inside air pockets in the torsion of collapsed compartments, and they tapped, first for rescue, then for contact, then for any signal that the living could reach the living. The rescue teams reported hearing those tappings, these mechanical pleas from within the iron ribs of a vessel becoming a tomb. They tried, in the desperate minutes and hours that followed, to cut, to pry, to pull out men whose breath and pulse still measured against the odds. Beyond the immediate numbers lies the symbolic aftermath. A machine that had been the epitome of naval permanence, massive guns, layered armor, and the confidence of steel, had been undone not by a bigger gun or cleverer armor, but by applied understanding of energy and soil. Engineers and physicists, not merely tacticians, had changed the rules. The tall boy did not depend on brute force alone. It exploited the interaction between mass, velocity, and medium. This was a turning point in the uneasy arithmetic of warfare. Fortification and mass could be rendered moot when someone took time to study the ground on which fortresses stand. There is also irony in the theater of human decision. For years, the ship's presence had demanded attention precisely because it refused to be sunk. Men and resources were funneled to counter it, and this attention only magnified its strategic value. Yet the same attention produced ingenuity among the besiegers. When tactics failed, technology advanced. When technology answered, tactics had to bend again. This dynamic is not a moral tale so much as a lesson in adaptability. The The rules of engagement in modern war are not fixed. They evolve when ingenuity finds a weakness and decides to press. If one wants to find one small human image to hold this complexity, consider the smokescreen and the wind. The order to make smoke was a simple, practiced act meant to protect. It remained an act even when the environment rendered it useless. That gap between action and effect is at the heart of tactical tragedies. The captain did not fail because he was reckless. He failed because material realities, calm wind, enemy innovation, the physics of a tall boy, slipped the nets of habit and expectation. The warning was there. The protection was also there. It simply could not do its job in the face of a weapon engineered to reach below the job they had defended. For engineers and historians, the lesson was clear and somewhat cold. War is a contest of systems, and systems can be reconfigured. For sailors and families, the lesson was a different kind of grief, that a place of safety could become a grave within 11 minutes. And for planners and policymakers, the end of that morning read as a memo to the future. The age of armor as absolute protection had been superseded by a new class of precision munitions that treated the ground as a theater of operations. The ship's collapse was not merely tactical defeat, it was a symbolic end of a doctrine. How should we remember the captain? The title invites us to imagine him ignoring a warning and paying with his life. In the archive we find corroborating facts: an alarm, an order to create smoke, the calm wind, the timing of tallboy impacts, and the 11-minute interval between the first subterranean explosion and the final capsize. What we do not possess are the private conversations that might tell us whether the captain hesitated, whether he believed the defense would hold, or whether he stayed at his post for professional reasons we can only imagine. The safe historical position is to present the sequence and the consequences, to allow the image of the captain on the bridge to stand for the paradoxes of command. Steadfastness that can look like obstinacy, loyalty that can look like fatalism, courage that can be indistinguishable from duty. At the same time, there is a larger, more abstract disappearance to consider, not only the man but the doctrine he represented. In those 11 minutes, a mode of naval power, visible, armored, and anchored, ceased to have the same purchase it once did. It was replaced by the cold arithmetic of destructive precision, an approach that valued understanding of materials and trajectory as much as the courage of crews. The sea had always been a place of sudden reversals. That morning, science and industry exercised a form of inevitability that tradition could not match. The practical aftershocks were immediate. Naval architects, strategists, and military thinkers re-evaluated assumptions about what made a ship survivable. Fortresses and fjords were no longer the same kind of deterrent. New countermeasures and doctrines would emerge, but the psychological shift had occurred. Fortification was not immutable. We might end the story as the title asks with the specific causal chain. There was a warning. It was issued as smoke. Environmental conditions rendered it ineffective. Tallboys struck beneath the hull beginning at 8:41 a.m. The ship's support failed through cascading structural collapse. At 8:52 a.m., 11 minutes later, the vessel capsized and the captain disappeared into the wreckage. Those are the facts that anchor the narrative. Around them spin questions of human judgment, of the moral weight of command, and of the strange ways in which technology can render obsolete not just equipment, but entire strategic mindsets. But beyond the chronology, there is a quieter reflection. The battlefield is a place where human decisions interface with immutable forces, gravity, momentum, and the behavior of Earth. The capitulation of a proud ship into the water is not merely the result of an officer's choice. It is also the meeting point of design and physics, of weather and timing. The warning, an order to create an illusion of protection, was real and meaningful within the world the captain knew. Yet the world had changed in ways he could not fully anticipate. History often compresses complex causality into a single image for the sake of story. The captain on the bridge, the alarm ignored, the mortal minute. That compression carries power, because it binds a human face to an event that otherwise might be abstract. It also risks simplification. To honor the dead and the survivors, we must let both images live together. the human figure of command and the indifferent mechanics of explosive physics. If the question remains, what does 11 minutes change? The answer is both literal and symbolic. Literally, it was the span between the first subterranean detonation and the irrevocable roll, a sequence measured by time and recorded by men pinned to a failing deck. Symbolically, it was the time it took for a new logic of war to convert a fortress into a ruin. In just a handful of minutes, the calculus of naval dominance shifted beneath the feet of those who had believed in permanence. If this story resonates with you, if you are drawn to detailed military history and the moments when technology redraws the map of possibility, subscribe for more. There are other episodes where a single innovation changed everything, where the rules of engagement were rewritten by someone willing to study the world rather than simply fight within it. In closing, remember the human core of the tale. The men who woke to a routine that turned catastrophic, the captain who stood and then was gone, the tapping survivors whose small signals pierced the metal ruins. Remember the eerie stillness of a wind that betrayed an entire defense plan. Remember, too, the engineers like Barnes-Wallace whose abstract thinking became a weapon. War is never only about courage or only about hardware. It is where the two meet, and sometimes suddenly where one exposes the limits of the other. The Fjord returned to quiet after that day. Mountains held the memory as they always had. Ships came and went. Men told the story at mess tables and in years of quiet. But 11 minutes on a November morning in 1944 changed not only a ship's fate, but the shape of future thinking. It is a reminder that warnings, even when given, are not impermeable shields. They are opportunities to change course. And when those chances are missed or thwarted by circumstance, the consequences can be total. If this account left you wanting more detail about the design of the Tallboy, the daring of the X-Craft, or the tactical adaptations of 617 Squadron, click through to the linked video that explores those innovations in depth. Like and subscribe if you appreciated this deep dive into how industry, physics, and human choices collided to topple a fortress in 11 minutes.